Hey, good morning. I'm Juuso. I'm the game art lead for Wargaming Helsinki, and I'm here today to talk to you about tanks, which is obvious for Wargaming, I guess, but here I am. And this talk is about kind of a specific pipeline we built to do one specific thing, which is to build about 100 tanks with about 3 people. And let's see. How does this work? All right, so generally about the project, it's Wargaming Helsinki's first game. Currently kind of chugging along nicely. It's mid-production. Kind of when you play it, it looks like a game, but it's definitely not done yet, so I can't really show all of it. But what I can disclose that it does have tanks in it, which is a big departure for Wargaming, for sure. But what is a big departure for Wargaming is that it's art style. So it's a stylized game, it's a more colorful world, kind of built from the ground up to work on phones, maybe like whereas World of Tanks proper is more, or other Wargaming games are a lot about like the simulation and the realism. We're more colorful, we're more kind of mobile focused. And the phrase we say a lot is that it's heavy but cute. So when we make our tanks, we want them to kind of, while their proportions are better for mobile games, they still need to feel heavy. If anything, they should feel heavier than real tanks. So kind of super bulky, funky things. And the challenge for this project, so when we set out to make it, so had completed the prototype, got the green light, we figured out a plan, and it came out that we need about, it's almost 150 tanks at launch to have enough content to go around. And that's a lot of tanks. And the tricky part about making them is that they can't be crappy. So it's the main kind of progression system of the whole game. It's the core collectible element you have. So they need to be really good. And for this thing, we have 1 concept artist and 2 3D artists. We have other artists too, but they need to make the rest of the game. And that's a tricky challenge. One way to solve it would be to outsource it, but we were super reluctant to do it, not really because it wouldn't work, perhaps, but it's just, even though we would outsource it, it's still a lot of work to kind of manage that all, and also, like, it's just risky. Like, maybe it would go fine, but we want to have full control over these things, because that's kind of, these are the things we need to sell to people. And so with those parameters, we sat down and went like, okay, well, how can this be done? Like if you were to just have, have concept art, make the 3D model, make the rig, make the animations with 3 people, that would take like 5 years minimum, probably. So we needed to figure out something more clever. So we sat down and thought about what is a tank really. So good thing about tanks is that they're basically like pretty simple things. So each tank has a hull in it, turret, barrel, standard things, a couple of wheels on it, tracks, and that's about it. Everything else is kind of just added props, so it's kind of armor plates and it's lights and it's basically stuff that's bolted onto the hull. But the basics of it is quite simple, and tanks don't really animate that much. Like, if you look at a tank shooting in real life, it almost doesn't move. It just moves the turret and pop. We want to do a little bit more because we're a bit more cartoony, but really, like, the animation part is quite simple. Like, if we were to make 100 kind of fully facial animated cool characters, like humanoids, we would be in big trouble. But luckily that's not the case. Let's see. So we figured out the basic idea for the pipeline. So when we thought about making a high volume of tanks, we thought about approaching it as parts. So in model building and kind of special effects shops, there's a concept of kit bashing, which basically means that you, in order to build something new, like maybe a cool spaceship for a sci-fi movie or whatever, you use existing model kits. So you take maybe like one plane model kit from there, you take model kit from a tank, you put stuff together, you paint it, you maybe do something a little bit custom, but that's kind of, you get a lot of the detail for free. And we figured that, hey, this might be a pretty good approach for tanks because they have a lot of stuff that's just bolted on. This will kind of end up being like a high detail, cool looking thing. And it could be doable by a smaller team. So one problem with that is that, of course, when you kit bash things, you end up with something that's very like highly detailed, especially for a mobile game. It's kind of, it's pushing the polygon limits a little bit, but we have a nice constraint in that we only have one tank on screen at once, so it's allowed to be inefficient. So, if it's pushing like 10K polygons, that's fine, because there's only one, and it's meant to be the collectible cool thing anyway, so how about put the detail in that instead of other things? And the idea would be that we build a bunch of tanks, we take the parts out of them, and for every kind of custom tank we make, we can extract a whole lot of parts and then do the in-between kind of kit bash tanks and get a lot of tanks for free. And animation, we just don't do it. So tank animation is so simple that the turret turning and the barrel kind of doing a little bit of recoil and the wheel spinning, that can all be done by code. Just need to make a couple of systems for it. And the biggest constraint for all of this is that everything has to be almost automatic. So if there's any part of this process that's like, well, here the 3D artist needs to clean up the 3D geometry for a day, like that's suddenly 100 days. And if there's a couple of those, it'll start taking years again. So we can't do that. All right, so now I can go through the process of how we actually make one of our tanks. So, as I mentioned, we only have one concept artist, and that's not enough to make like concepts for 150 tanks. So that he would burn out. So we do something a little bit different. So instead of making concepts for each individual tank or something like that, we instead make general guidelines. So we split our tanks into kind of tank families, or we internally call them manufacturers. So it's kind of like a tank that looks a certain way, has this certain shape language, and here's a concept art for one of those. So the idea here is that what the concept artist does is first he makes one cool tank. So that's concept art for one sick late game, when you get the last tank in the game from this manufacturer, it looks something like that. And then the other stuff is kind of general, like just sketches on like, okay, well, when you make parts for this tank family, you need to make parts that look a little something like this. When tanks like this are high level, they have parts that look like that, and when they're low level, they have something else. And then there's other stuff like, logos and general like graphics on like what sort of paint they should have on the sides. But that's it. From this one piece of concept art, we do like at least 30 tanks. And here's just another example, because it's cool. This is kind of a late game tank manufacturer, but the idea is that the tanks look like boats. That's my favorite. And yeah, next up, so one of our 3D artists will start making models. So I spoke already that we want to have like a really large chunk of parts to use. And while you could just make parts, so we could sit down and say like, okay, we're making like 100 turrets today, or like, hey, we're making 60 wheels. That's pretty tricky. One, it's like it would like morally kill all the artists probably, and also like it's really hard to do good stuff like that, because you would end up like just making things in a vacuum, and then when you put them all together, it might end up looking super random. So instead, we do whole tanks like this, and from this one tank, we can extract a whole bunch of parts. So that's maybe like, I don't know, at least 20 different things we can use in the future. And this is since we don't have like concept art for this specifically, we just have some guidelines on what a tank might generally look like. It's a very back and forth process between the concept artist and the 3D guy. So basically, you do a quick block out, you send it to the concept artist, go like, is this cool, is this funky enough? All right, no, and then back and forth, and it's maybe like 3 or 4 times, usually. And then we end up with something that looks like this. And also, the nice benefit of having this be like so this is custom built, so we reserve this for the rarest, like kind of in the game world, for the most premium, most rare tanks, because they're handmade, so usually they end up looking a little bit better than the other stuff. So we kind of get a nice premium tank for free from that process. And next up, so we need to split it into parts, and that looks a little bit something like this. So from that one tank, we got this library of things that we can now in the future use on anything. We used to do this ourselves, take apart the tank, put the parts into place, do all the unwrapping and that sort of stuff. But as it turns out, that takes forever and is tedious. So that's what we use outsourcing for. So this is a nice part of the process that's kind of, well, it's unfair to call it non-creative, but it's kind of, it's a lot of manual work, basically, and something we can't afford to do ourselves. So this we ship to the outsourcing partner, get back cool parts, and we're super happy to not have to do it ourselves. And also, From them, we get low poly kind of final game meshes. So the parts you saw before were the high poly kind of stuff we use for baking textures and maybe like marketing assets and stuff like that. But this is the actual geometry that goes in the game. And yeah, this is all done externally, and like our artists are thankful for it. All right, so next up, and this is kind of the most custom part of this whole thing. So once we have all these parts, we've done all the work, we now get to assemble it. So for this, we have built something that looks like this. And you might recognize it as looking like Unity. It is Unity. It's our custom kind of Unity project that has all our tank parts in it. So basically, we dump all the stuff we have. We have a kind of basic set of tools for editing these things. So you can do basic operations like add symmetric parts here and there, add, flip a thing, make sure the tracks are the right way around. Just basic tools to help like the everyday assembly process go faster. It's kind of like building Legos. That's a very like marketing way to put it. It's not as fun as building Legos, but it's all right. And this is something our artists like. This is the main thing they do usually. And so from that point on, from the previous shot you saw of this kind of awesome neon colored tank, you press a button. It's one button, and you get that. So that's our final game-ready model. It doesn't move in this, but it is animated. It's got the textures, the cool bits, and yeah, that's not actually one button. But it's almost one button. So basically, what we do from having the assembled thing in the tank builder software thingy, is that so you press one button and basically starts a massive script, which makes both the high and low poly versions of the final tank, so you can use them for texture baking and the marketing and all that. It does all the things we need for the programming animation stuff, so it separates the turret, it separates the barrel, it makes sure all the wheels spin the right way, and it makes basically separate meshes out of those. And most importantly, it transfers all the material information. So texturing would take quite a while if we didn't have something to help with it. So if you look at, let's go back a little bit. If you look at that, the neon colors are basically like material IDs. So it tells the texturing software, okay, this part's made of metal, this part's made of this other metal, this part's fabric, these are the wheels, and that sort of stuff. And with that, in Substance Painter, we can automate a lot on what we actually use in texturing. And that's the basics. So that's of course a lot of work to do just to get one tank in the game, because you're doing all the parts thing, you're shipping stuff out, getting them back, and doing this. But now is the kind of actual good part about it. So now you get to make more. So these are a couple of like tanks our 3D artist assembled in the tank tools. So this would typically take like no more than a day each to make. So maybe some of them a little bit longer, some of them, we can do like 3 a week, basically for this and the texturing part, but it is quite fast. And from these things, you get tanks that look like that. So pretty distinct. I would challenge people to like try to find like where are the kit bashed parts and stuff like that. When you do texturing and add all the finishing touches, like you get quite different things. Texturing wise, of course, like you get a nice baseline texture pretty much for free, but we do a lot of like kind of the final touches by hand. So if you look at, go back to this a little bit, like for this, for instance, the markings you do and the camouflage pattern, those are things we do by hand. And that's, it takes a little bit of time. Maybe on average, we have like a day to texture, well, add the finishing touches basically to the tank, but that's worth it to have them look different. Otherwise, you would be able to start seeing like, okay, wait a minute, this tank is almost the same as that one, but it has those parts. But when you put in the effort in the texturing, you like make those differences go away. And some general learnings from all this. So I think the number one thing is that, like while making this stuff, we learned is that as the project progresses, like artists grow very familiar with the style and the way things need to be made. So in the beginning, when you start out a thing, you figure out an art style. Of course, artists need a lot of help from concept art. They need a lot of like guidance on like how should you make these angles typically. But as the project goes on, like the need for that goes down quite a bit. So like if you think about making many of the, like let's say 100 tanks, for example, like you definitely don't need concept art for 100 tanks. Like you need to kind of enough concept art to get the artists going, but from that point on, like you can trust them to figure it out on their own. And also you need to adapt the project's pipeline as you do this, because in the beginning everything's very rigid, but as you go on you can like start to look at, okay, let's cut some corners and do this a little different. And the pipeline we have for our tanks is, of course, it's super specific to like one use case. So like you don't want these tools unless you're making 100 tanks. In which case, let's talk. But I think this general learnings is that like kind of try to think about, like, especially if you're making a high volume of things, try to think about what you're making. Where can you cut corners? Where can you cheat a little bit? And that's the sort of problems that I like to solve a lot. Thanks.
And we do have time for questions, so yes, just a second. I lost you, sorry.
So hi, how did the workflow evolve? Did you make a lot of mistakes? Like, did you go wrong paths, or did it just naturally, organically evolve when you were doing stuff?
You mean like initially building the pipeline up?
Yeah.
Yeah.
How did you come up with this particle system for your particle?
Yeah. So like, I think initially, like the first version of these tools, like in the main features, it's pretty much the same as it is now. But this is definitely something that you can't just like build a pipeline and forget it. Like you need to constantly be thinking about, like, okay, like it looks like when we're doing these textures, we're like our artist is spending one day doing this menial crap. And then you need to look at, okay, well, let's automate that part. I can't remember any massive changes in the way we make these things, but it's a lot of like we've added things to the pipeline, added like, let's say the tank shoot in the game, so we've added all sorts of systems to automatically put, you know, anchor points and stuff like that to make the whole process, like basically take all the manual labor out of it, if we can.
More questions?
This guy?
Yes, oh, sorry. I'm half blind at the moment, sorry for that. All yours.
In your pre-production stage, when you were trying to work out, you know, what this pipeline should look like, what did you do? What were your kind of opening stages? Did you just build 3 tanks and see what's needed in building those 3 tanks, or how did that come about?
Yeah, basically we built like maybe 5 tanks. We had concepts, you know, did the initial concept art, and we built the 5 tanks by hand. We did like hand animation for all of them. They had like all different small bits that, you know, moved a little bit. We actually had suspension and that sort of stuff. And then we actually, okay, first we checked the game. Okay, like suspension, we have kind of like a top-down angle for our game, so you don't even see the suspension, so we got that. Then we saw, okay, what else is here? And then we noticed that basically the whole tank is the hull and then stuff bolted on, and that's how we got the idea for the kit bashing thing, and then it kind of went on from there. But definitely we established the art style first, before thinking about any of this.
We have time, I think, for at least one more question. Yes?
Yeah, thank you. You talked a lot about the art side, but how many developers or what kind of tool support do you have in your team?
The tool support at the moment is basically me. So, well, I'm the art lead, but also I do the technical artist type stuff, so I've made most of those things. We have one kind of, basically, every now and again we pick a random programmer to help us with the tools on the kind of in the final gameplay side, but the rest of it is kind of one technical artist. Using Unity or something similar definitely takes a lot of the overhead away from like having to do a whole bunch of boilerplate stuff first.
Okay. Thank you very much. Please give a big hand to.
Thank you.